This video would not be possible without the support of my backers on Patreon. If you'd like to support this channel and the creation of future videos like this one, or if you'd like to get access to some videos early, consider joining my Patreon. All help is greatly appreciated, and enjoy the video. The Killing of a Sacred Deer is a movie I am in awe of. It's a film that's hard to recommend because its premise is bleak, its presentation is cold, and there isn't a lot to latch onto in the narrative or characters to make the viewing experience pleasant. It's a film that makes my skin crawl, but it's one of the most engaging and impactful horror films I've ever seen. I have a running theory that all of the best horror films are secretly great comedy films, and a lot of the best comedy films are secretly great horror. I first caught on to this as a teenager when I watched Kubrick's The Shining and found it weirdly funny, and then later watched Dr. Strangelove and found it weirdly upsetting. It's because Kubrick understands that darkness is not something to fear, but to contend with, to come to grips with. The best horror, then, is horror that helps you process disturbing thoughts, trauma, and some of your worst fears. It's not the fact that several people die in Halloween that makes it a great horror film. It's that at the end, Laurie Strode gets away. Horror does not work without first presenting darkness, then allowing the viewer an emotional space in which to confront said darkness. The Killing of a Sacred Deer is horror done so right that it's funny. And I mean that literally. I think The Killing of a Sacred Deer is actually a deeply twisted, extremely dark comedy. I think it was intended to be funny, but I think it was also intended to be scary. And not in the horror comedy sense where the horror is undercut by humor. The horror is humorous. The humor is horrific. The Killing of a Sacred Deer is the closest that a filmmaker has come to capturing what makes The Shining a truly special horror film, and I don't think that's coincidence. Given Lanthimos' love of the Kubrickian parallel hallway shots, the usage of lots of still shots and the occasional Steadicam work, and the fact that The Killing of a Sacred Deer is a film about an emotionally isolated nuclear family gradually going insane together, it seems apparent that Lanthimos was at least partly influenced by Kubrick in The Shining. And I am not one to easily suggest that something is Kubrick-esque. I think it takes more than just being cold and dry or using some fancy Steadicam work to qualify as similar to Kubrick. What makes Kubrick special isn't his style, but his subjects and how he approaches them. At the core of every Kubrick film is a story about how social and political systems become the undoing of the individual human. And this is where The Killing of a Sacred Deer most excels. Not in being scary or upsetting or well shot and well edited, but in being a film about undoing. So what exactly does this mean? It goes without saying that from here on out will be spoilers. I really recommend seeing this film before getting spoiled if you haven't, because this is going to be a more in-depth look at the narrative, which will give away a lot of stuff that's worth seeing for the first time without knowing it's coming up. Now let's talk about it. The Killing of a Sacred Deer centers on a heart surgeon, Dr. Stephen Murphy, and his family. Wife Anna, older daughter Kim, and younger son Bob. Early in the film, we see that Stephen has somehow become acquainted with a strange and very awkward teenage boy, Martin. Martin wants to become a cardiologist and learns details about Stephen's profession through him and his coworkers. Quickly, we see that there's something strange about Martin, something off. Through the course of the film, we learn that Martin's father died during a heart surgery that Stephen performed. Stephen befriending Martin appears to be motivated at least partly by guilt, with Stephen opting to take on a role in Martin's life that is somewhat paternal, even if only subconsciously. Martin meets Stephen's family one day, and then insists on returning the favor and having Stephen meet Martin's mother. Stephen obliges, but becomes distant from Martin's family after Martin's mother begins hitting on him. Soon after, Stephen's son Bob wakes up one morning to discover that he can't move his legs. When they bring him to the hospital, the doctors are confounded, with Bob seemingly able to gain control of his legs again briefly, then collapsing on his way out of the hospital. Martin informs Stephen that he's placed a curse on Stephen's family. Martin views Stephen as responsible for his father's death, and just as Stephen killed a member of Martin's family, one member of Stephen's family must die. Martin tells Stephen that he has to choose a family member to kill between his wife and his 2 kids. If Stephen does not act quickly, the curse is such that the family members will all begin to die slowly, first losing their ability to walk, and then their ability to eat before they'll begin bleeding from the eyes and die only hours later. Stephen tries everything he can in his power to rule out the possibility that what is going on is really a curse, opting instead to first believe it might be some kind of neurological disorder, before believing it might be psychosomatic, also at one point believing it to be a prank or an excuse to get out of school anxiety for Bob. It's only when Kim collapses at choir practice that Stephen begins to take seriously the possibility that this curse really is real. Some of the best doctors in the world, after all, are unable to find any known cause as to why both children have lost control of their limbs and seem incapable of eating food. I won't give a scene-for-scene recap, but in short, from this point in the story, the family falls into disarray. Stephen becomes increasingly agitated, Anna becomes increasingly distant, and the children become increasingly opportunistic. Normally, when I watch a movie, particularly a thriller or horror, I try to think about what I would do in this situation, or at least what I would most like to do when faced with the hypothetical the story presents. If a character goes so far out of the range of something I would do, I find it difficult to relate or appreciate the outcomes that result from character actions. I usually picture what would be the most reasoned, most compassionate, and most openly communicative approach. Needless to say, Stephen and his family do not act even remotely the way I would want to in this situation. But while that can serve to a film's detriment, it serves to the film's benefit here because The Killing of a Sacred Deer is a very morbid social satire. The premise is just a premise. The curse is just a thing that happens to the family and is given little significance beyond its effects. It's their reactions, their decisions, that communicate the themes of the film. Because really, The Killing of a Sacred Deer is a film that is heavily critical of the normative nuclear family. This isn't new for Lanthimos. His previous film, The Lobster, also was heavily critical of the nuclear family and of heteronormativity more broadly, and while I haven't seen his film Dogtooth, I have reason to believe it carries similar themes based on what I've heard. It's a bit of a running theme in his work, and The Killing of a Sacred Deer benefits from having the characters make decisions that seem at times to be sociopathic or deranged, because it indicates things about who they are not just individually, but systemically. A heart surgeon is not just an everyday person. Stephen is a man who is responsible for saving lives, and more specifically, he saves lives for money. He makes serious amounts of money from being a doctor, and his entire family reaps the benefits of this dynamic. They live an upper middle class lifestyle bordering on full-on upper class, and hardship is not something they would typically ever have to worry about. Put simply, they're privileged. And while Martin's life is definitely not the worst it could be in terms of class, Martin comes from a significantly poorer family, with much worse prospects than what he aspires to, being raised by a single mother after Martin's father died as a consequence of Stephen's actions as a doctor. Martin not only has it worse than Stephen, he has it significantly worse because of Stephen. We learn that Stephen had been drinking the day before Martin's father's surgery, and thus is likely the primary reason why Martin's father didn't make it. Stephen justifies the death to himself to absolve himself of guilt. He seems to lack any compassion for Martin, and sees his status as a good doctor as so worthy of maintaining that he even resolves to blame the anesthesiologist for Martin's father's death, arguing that not only is the death of a patient not Stephen's fault, but it categorically could never be his fault. This is a complete lack of empathy and compassion. It's a form of narcissism, where Stephen's self-image and social status comes before anything else. We learn this gradually throughout the film, but it's hinted at early on, and the initial signs become more pronounced after viewing the film in full. Stephen is a bad person disguised as a good person, because he ultimately only cares about himself, viewing his family, his friends, and his patients as a means to an end that serves to benefit him primarily, sometimes even exclusively. This is what power does. Because Stephen has a position of power over Martin, he pities Martin. And when Martin begins asserting power over him through the hex he puts on Stephen's family, Stephen begins to deeply resent Martin, to not view him as a human being anymore, ultimately kidnapping, torturing, and threatening to murder Martin in order to force Martin to stop the hex, rather than to try to understand where Martin is coming from even remotely. It's the fact that Stephen never stops to see Martin as a human being and try to listen or understand him that ends up being his undoing. We see that when Kim listens to Martin and does what he asks, she regains the ability to walk, suggesting that Martin has some form of control in which he can end the curse or manipulate it to his liking. And while Kim, who is in love with Martin, or at least pretends to be, is more willing to submit, it's Stephen's masculinity, his paternalistic ambitions, his narcissism, that makes it impossible for Stephen to do the same. Stephen is the American ideal, the ultimate patriarchal man, same as Jack in The Shining. He has power over his children and wife. The nuclear family dynamic affords him a degree of comfort in this role of power. He treats Martin much like a child, seeking a similar manner of comfort in being above Martin rather than equal to him, and the same is true of his patients. This is what a normative nuclear family dynamic is like, and becomes more so the case the higher in class status a family is, because the traditions of patriarchy are more ingrained in families where men make the most money and are surrounded by a more traditionalist culture. Martin's family, absent a patriarch, does not function the same way. Martin's family represents a potential failure that Stephen's family could one day fall prey to, the failure of a patriarch to govern and control his subordinates, namely his wife and children. The curse, rather than being an upending of the patriarchal dynamic, is an exacerbation of it, taking it to a cruel extreme. Stephen now has the most possible control over his family. He could choose to let them all die, or he could choose to kill one of them, with his decision being permanently consequential for the rest of his family, including those left alive after the decision is made. It's when Stephen is faced with this cruel, ironic twist on the patriarchal dynamic that he has to come face to face with the fact that he doesn't want that kind of power, not when it doesn't benefit him anymore. This is where the film gains its satirical bite. The patriarchal family dynamic is destructive, arguably even self-destructive, by nature. When men hold power over their families and treat their family members like objects for their own means, it inevitably rips their families apart. The effect of a hyper-patriarchal family dynamic on families is that the rest of the family becomes hostage to the whims of the patriarch, who has the most financial, legal, and cultural control. And the effect it has on the man is unwanted pressure and contradictory expectations, where they have to simultaneously protect and serve the best interest of their family, but also control, correct, and manage their family. The curse in Killing of a Sacred Deer is not just a metaphysical curse, but a psychological curse, one which reveals the darker sides of what it means to have a family. The film portrays family not as a source of love and togetherness, but as an arrangement, a social contract in which each member is designated a role that they must fulfill to keep the family unit afloat, at the expense of themselves as individuals. What makes this curse so effective at conveying these themes is what it will do to the family after the decision is made. If Stephen lets his entire family die, he will be the ultimate failure of a father and husband. He will be the ultimate failure of the patriarch that he desires to be. If, instead, he makes a decision to kill one of them, the rest will have to live with the knowledge that their family is built on a lie, that the safety they feel under Stephen's protection is hollow, and that he ultimately did, and thus continuously will, decide whether they get to live or die. They each have to live with the thought, it could have been me, while also undergoing the curse throughout the film as, it could be me. And it says a lot that, rather than open communication or attempting to navigate the situation together, the family instead all breaks apart into various forms of manipulation of others to try to not be the one to die. The curse unveils the truth about the family dynamic that was there well prior, that patriarchy and the nuclear family model are compulsory and performative, and not actually a reflection of some deeper spiritual or interrelational love and connection. Stephen's wife, Anna, begins giving out sexual favors to one of Stephen's co-workers in exchange for information. She also begins trying to give sexual favors to Stephen in exchange for Stephen sparing her life, even suggesting that if he kills one of the kids, they can always have another kid, suggesting that she also views her children as just objects for the sake of fulfilling her role as an ideal wife and mother. A continuation of ideas explored in The Lobster, there's a recurring theme in Killing of a Sacred Deer about how gender roles inform decision-making processes. In this case, Anna's decision to use sexuality to her advantage in an attempt to save her life shows how she understands the world around her and how her femininity will be contextualized within it. She is objectively being manipulative to get what she wants, but we need to keep in mind that she is effectively being held hostage, likely to either be murdered or die slowly if she doesn't play her cards right, so to speak. But it speaks to how women have to operate in a heteronormative patriarchal society to attempt to get what they want from the world. They have to cozy up to men, using their attractiveness and sexuality to their advantage. In this way, women self-objectify, not out of free will but out of societal pressure. They take on a role of being objects for men's pleasure, and this is made very blunt in the film even prior to the curse, with a recurring image of Anna lying down naked on the bed, pretending to be unconscious to fulfill some strange sexual fetish that Stephen has. Stephen likes when Anna is just an object, and Anna obliges. The fact that she does this both before and after the curse has been placed on her is telling. Specifically, it makes me think that Anna was always sort of an object for Stephen's benefit well prior to the curse, but also that she's been fulfilling a role of wife and mother in a similar manner before and after the curse. In other words, she seeks the benefits of a patriarchal arrangement all the same, and she knows her place in it. Rather than seeking freedom from always being an object for men to seek pleasure from, she seeks the benefits of being objectified. The allure of a heteronormative patriarchal dynamic is not exclusive to wealthy men, but can be highly tempting to wealthy women too. Stephen's daughter, Kim, begins cozying up to Martin, hoping that Martin will spare her somehow, or undo the curse so that she can get away from her family. This is interesting because to me it says that Kim is in some ways emulating her mother, that Kim, even as a teenager, is understanding her place in a patriarchal dynamic as an object for male affection. Interestingly enough, with Martin, it doesn't really work. Martin isn't the wealthy patriarch that Stephen is, and while he misses his father and wishes well for his mother, he doesn't replicate all of the same ideological traits as Stephen does. Prior to the placing of the curse, Kim gets undressed in front of Martin and tries to get Martin to have sex with her, specifically getting into a passive position and waiting for Martin to approach her. He refuses. Martin does not inhabit the same lifestyle of a wealthy patriarchal family. Martin seeks justice, and while his actions in the film are abhorrent, I'd caution to look at Martin's character in the same way as we might the family. Martin is, in essence, a mirror for the Murphy family. It's their interactions with him and how they contrast with him that is of note. Martin has agency in the narrative, but the narrative isn't really about him beyond how he has been impacted by the Murphy family, prior to and throughout the course of the film. Throughout the film, we see the children begin to take on roles that are more traditional and more in line with Stephen's wishes, suggesting that they understand the arrangement of a patriarchal dynamic same as Anna. Prior to the curse, Stephen expressed a wish for Bob to cut his hair short. Long hair, of course, can be read as unkempt, lower class, or even gender non-conforming for a boy. After becoming cursed, Bob crawls through the house to find scissors so that he can cut his hair short to show his father that he did what Stephen wanted. He also tells Stephen that he wants to be a heart doctor himself, just like his father. In order to cozy up to Stephen and convince Stephen that he's worth sparing the life of, Bob conforms more tightly to Stephen's vision of him, reflecting Stephen's role as a patriarch and a man of a high-class status. In all cases, individual family members choose themselves and self-preservation over sacrifice for the others. While this is clearly a family in dysfunction at the time of the curse, each individual acting autonomously against the better interest of the others and only to suit their own self-interest, one can easily get the impression that this family was always dysfunctional, and that this dysfunction stems from the norms of gender that they have been expected to play out all their lives. We see an obvious element of self-interest in their actions, and we even see spitefulness, with Anna suggesting that the kids should be killed and herself spared, Kim telling Bob that the parents are likely going to kill him, and Bob telling Kim that the parents are likely going to kill her. They all pick a specific victim to put their stock in order to convince themselves that they will be okay. It's worth noting that there is no direct, open communication about the process of deciding who dies. Rather than a measured, compassionate plan, they each pursue self-preservation at the cost of the others, with no concern for their well-being. Not one time does any family member express grief at the thought of another member of the family dying, because this is not a loving family. Their actions through the later parts of the film recontextualize the first act. The ideal nuclear family dynamic they were living prior, where everyone played their ideal role, was all a lie. They were all pretending to love and care about one another because it allowed them to fit a standard that was beneficial to them. And once it served them better to eat each other alive, they began doing so in no time at all. Now, there are things to consider when talking about the way these characters behave. First, we have to wonder about what they think of Stephen. What was the family dynamic like for them? Was Stephen a controlling, domineering man? Was he emotionally abusive? Physically abusive? These are all things we can speculate on, but never actually learn. But what we do learn about the family through the course of the film is that they expect things of Stephen. The kids expect him to choose one of the kids over his wife. The wife expects him to choose herself and tries to deflect towards killing one of the kids instead. This suggests that, on some deeper level, they're afraid of him. None of them have confidence in Stephen that he wouldn't murder them, and none of them have a willingness to communicate with him in a non-manipulative manner. Instead, they choose to dance around his ego, to rarely if ever question him or threaten him, because they know they could be the one dead. Is this fear something unique to this situation, or does it stem from past experiences of knowing what he's really like? See, in a well-functioning family, communication, even in dire circumstances, could be possible. But in a dysfunctional family, communication is usually ineffective because of the dysfunction. If you have a family that can't communicate and reach a mutual understanding or agreement, it becomes much easier to dance around people's feelings or one's own, to avoid saying what you think and instead say what you think they want to hear. Regardless of the family's past, Stephen's family currently are in a situation where they revolve around what they think Stephen wants to hear. And we know this cuts not just to the heart of the situation, but to the heart of Stephen as a person. Because when Anna does antagonize Stephen to try to get him to be reasonable about the situation, Stephen becomes aggressively mean towards her, making a mess of the kitchen and mocking her, belittling her perspective. Any attempts at communication with a man this stubborn and volatile would likely be for the worse. Stephen's inability to come to grips with the situation as it stands suggests a delicate balance that his life had been hanging on. He relied on the comfort of never having to make a difficult decision. He relied on the comfort of never having to be responsible for another person's life, even as he literally was responsible for the lives of others for a living. He developed narcissistic coping mechanisms that put him at the center of his world and all others as existing primarily to orbit around his desires and insecurities. And so when faced with a situation where he has loss of control, where his family is in danger, he becomes petulant, mean, avoidant, cold, and violent. These are the actions of abusers. Abusers will go to great lengths to return to the comfortable position that is afforded to them by the abuse itself. Abuse is used as a method of ensuring that they can continue to exist in the state that they wish. Rather than adapting to change or accommodating change, abusers will design their lives through abuse to make change impossible or very difficult so that others in their lives are unlikely to ever attempt to seek change. This is what we see of Stephen. He's highly manipulative and views his family as subhuman. Early on, when Bob seems to have no medical problems but is incapable of walking and begins losing his appetite, Stephen begins to try to force-feed him donuts, to try to prove that Martin's curse is fake. He then tells Bob a very intimate and somewhat sketchy secret about an experience with incest he had as a child, to try to convince Bob to give up the obvious fact that he's only pretending to be paralyzed. This opening up about a secret was a form of manipulation, trying to coerce a confession out of Bob through guilt-tripping and feigned emotional intimacy. The fact that Stephen so quickly and shamelessly engages in this emotional manipulation suggests that it might not be all that new of a behavior from him. Rather than taking Bob at his word or trying to dig deeper to find a more nuanced understanding of what Bob is going through, Stephen is so confident in his view of the world and of the situation that he repeatedly abuses Bob to try to force Bob to behave in a manner that, in the moment, he literally cannot. Thus, the nuclear family dynamic we see in the film was built on the possibility of abuse at any moment. That Stephen can become so cruel to his family under these circumstances suggests that this cruelty was always within him somewhere, and thus his family wouldn't be able to live with the same comfort that he stands to gain from having power over them. When Kim runs away from home, literally crawling on the sidewalk with only her arms functioning, Stephen finds her and grabs her, forcing her back to the home. Effectively, he begins holding the family hostage, where the burden of his decision becomes their burden too. He lingers and waits as the children become increasingly sick, so that he can stall making a decision as long as he can, in the vain hopes that he won't actually have to make a choice. Then, as he begins to see that the choice is inevitable, he chooses, instead of communicating and trying to figure out an option that would be least awful for the whole family, to instead actually hold them hostage, tying them up and putting pillow sacks over their heads. In the climactic scene where he makes the decision about who to kill, I expected, after he tied, gagged, and blindfolded the whole family, that he would make a decision in this moment that would say something about his character and how he feels about the family. And he did, but it was a long ways from what I expected. Instead of choosing one person to kill, he blindfolds himself, spinning around and then shooting at random moments, missing the shots and not killing anyone for a few rounds, before finally landing a shot that ends up killing Bob. This reveals the true nature of Stephen's character, that all of the control he wants, all of the power and authority he enjoys having as a surgeon and father, is something that comes with responsibilities he is too cowardly to bear. In other words, rather than just making a decision, he decided to take the approach that absolved him of any responsibility in who ends up dead. He decided to just make it completely random, so that way he would have an excuse to absolve himself of guilt, the same way he excused himself from the guilt of killing Martin's father. Rather than learning the lesson that Martin attempted to teach him about the responsibility that he has through his position of power, he decided that he wanted to maintain the power but avoid the responsibility. Thus, Stephen is the ultimate failed patriarch, a man who is completely unwilling to take control or responsibility in a meaningful way. And while the best approach would have been a more compassionate and communicative one, it's apparent that the reason he avoided this approach is because he is just too pathetic to give up the comfort of having power without having to feel bad about it. He wants to live in denial. He wants to continue to live the lie of the nuclear family, even knowing full well the consequences of said lie. At the end of the film, the family goes back to being a quote-unquote loving normal family, minus their youngest child, all continuing to live in denial while recognizing deep inside that they do not love each other, and they do not care if any other one of them dies, so long as they can maintain the comfortable position that being a rich family affords them. The ending is bleak, not because of what they went through throughout the film, but because of what they will now undergo in their lives after. Because the willful ignorance they had prior to Martin's curse has become more pronounced and more pathetic. They know that each one of them does not love or would sacrifice for one another in any meaningful way. They each know that they are stuck in a meaningless, abusive, dysfunctional lifestyle surrounded by narcissists who see one another as mere objects for their own gain. This is what the nuclear family as a social construct does to people. It isn't dependent solely on the intentions of each family member as individuals. The dynamic itself produces often exploitative and abusive outcomes. A hierarchical model of family that privileges men and subjugates women and children does not result in healthy, functioning families. Instead, it produces dysfunction with the illusion of function. Satire, even at its best, rarely suggests meaningful solutions, but it's great at identifying social, political, and cultural problems. The killing of a sacred deer points to the risks and dangers associated with giving up one's own individual power and autonomy to another person with systemic power over you. This is presented both in the nuclear family dynamic and in the healthcare dynamic. When you need heart surgery, you should absolutely get heart surgery. But it is noteworthy that the medical industry does in many ways replicate a patriarchal structure, with the patient being at the behest of often a single doctor, who ultimately decides the well-being of the patient and is entrusted with that power to do the right thing. There are laws against medical malpractice, but the option to bring those guilty of malpractice to justice is significantly limited for patients given the cultural and financial factors that greatly privilege doctors over everyday people. Stephen's being drawn to heart surgery makes sense when you see how he treats his family. He enjoys the control. He enjoys getting to make the decisions for his family. We see it in subtle ways prior to the curse, with his picking out a dress for his wife to wear to an award ceremony, his pressuring his son to get a haircut that more resembles his own taste than his son's, etc. The turning point in the narrative is when Stephen rejects Martin's mother's advances. She does do something that could be considered sexual assault, and that's unacceptable, but it's his response that is interesting. Rather than a clear statement of rejection followed by open communication with his own wife, he keeps the flirting and unwanted activity secret from his wife. He also kept secret his ongoing friendship with Martin for half a year, and kept secret the fact that Martin made statements about placing a curse on Stephen's family. Stephen always seeks that which allows him the comfort of knowing he will get what he wants. To him, the people around him are little more than objects. This is literalized by the fact that he seems to have a sexual fetish for unconscious women, having Anna pretend to be unconscious for sex. That same streak of control is present in Anna, who tries to get answers from Martin, being deeply upset when he doesn't give her the answer she wanted. A recurring theme is the struggle between those who desire control over others and the individual autonomy of said others. So when Stephen rejects Martin's mother's advances, despite being fair to do so, there's a nasty undercurrent to it. Stephen doesn't reject it because it's harmful to his family or because he has no interest in Martin's mother or anything of the sort. It's because he wants to be in a dominant role. He is repulsed by the fact that someone did something that disempowered him or that went against his desire for control. Stephen is a broken person who has cultivated a family of broken people, but their brokenness is disguised by their wealth, their cultural class, his profession, and their upstanding roles in the family and in their community. Martin's family is also broken both as individuals and as a unit, but this brokenness is not disguised. Martin is clearly strange and off-putting. His mother is clearly desperate and socially awkward. This is an image that would, for Stephen, be a source of disgust and pity. So when Martin gains power over him, it becomes the ultimate form of humiliation. Stephen isn't like Martin. At least, he desperately wishes for that to be true, and he convinces himself of it. His choice to recklessly drink before performing a surgery on Martin's father, as well as his willingness to shirk all responsibility after the fact by leaning on the idea of his own infallibility, suggests that he is very much like Martin, that Martin's actions towards Stephen's family are not that different from Stephen's actions towards Martin's family, that Stephen really is just as selfish and cruel as Martin. Martin and his family represent the ultimate failure that Stephen is most afraid of on two levels. First, Martin's family represents the image of a broken home, the failure of a patriarch, the failure of a nuclear family unit. Second, Martin's family represents the image of that image. In other words, Stephen is not just afraid of becoming like Martin's family because Martin's family is dysfunctional and its members severely unwell. Stephen is also afraid of becoming like Martin's family because Martin's family can't hide this dysfunction from others in Martin's life. Stephen is not just afraid that his family is broken like Martin's, but that he can't hide this brokenness from the world. The ending of the film is a victory for Stephen's social image and a horrible failure for Stephen's self-image. Stephen knows now that his family is broken, but he succeeded in returning to the lie that they're normal like everyone else. Thus, the final point I'd like to make about the film for now. The nuclear family norm, the patriarchal norm, is not just powerful in its construction, but in its image. The image of being a normal or good family, of being good people, so to speak, is such a powerful image that people will seek it out even at the expense of their lives or well-being. They will seek to be seen as normal or good people so intensely that they will, in the process, become horrible to themselves and one another. And if they can succeed in upholding the image of an ideal nuclear family, then the consequences of that image on the family and its individual members become safe to ignore. They can all suffer quietly together forever, knowing that they are living a meaningless and miserable life, while continuing to reap the material and cultural benefits of being seen as having the good life. Martin cannot afford those same material or cultural benefits, and he exists as a reminder to Stephen's family of how much they stand to lose if they do not continue to ignore the dysfunction within their own family. He exists to remind them that they had to sacrifice their moral character for their social character. The Killing of a Sacred Deer is a film that gets most of its power from how its characters behave. It's almost sickening to watch, because you want them to make better decisions, but you understand why they don't. It's a film that gets you to think like a sociopath, to think like someone incapable of pursuing anything other than self-interest, and then reveals how pathetic such a perspective would make someone behave. It's horrific because it reveals the norms that our lives are constructed around to be a sham that benefits the selfish and amoral, that real familial love is not guaranteed by a normative familial dynamic, and that it is possible to live a life without meaning while still living the way people are quote-unquote supposed to live. It's also highly comedic, because it shows that at the core of the most respected and powerful people in our day-to-day lives is a profound hollowness and cowardice that rests on privilege to ignore how pathetic their worldview actually is. It's a hilarious movie because it puts a family through a horribly bleak situation and somehow convinces us not to feel all that sorry for them. And what sorrow we do feel isn't compassion, but pity. And this opens up the last question that the film left me with. If we look down on them, if we get joy from their suffering, are we better than them really? Just because they're awful people doesn't mean they deserve to go through an intense family trauma or lose a family member. Should we not seek to be compassionate if we wish to avoid the point made about how a non-compassionate lifestyle makes people do horrible things to one another? Well, that's what makes the film so powerful. It takes an objective look at their lives. We exist as flies on the wall, witnessing their suffering without being a part of it. We do see how it impacts them, but we don't see much from a subjective lens. We don't see much in the way of grief, despair, love, or other emotions one would assume would come out during such a hard time for a family like this. Instead, we see them treat one another and themselves as little more than objects in a game, like a lopsided game of chess where each family member is trying to avoid check while putting everyone else in it. It just is hard to feel bad for them, because they don't feel bad for themselves. They've chosen this non-compassionate, cold, clinical life. They've chosen dysfunction. Whether this can be seen as a critique of the director's approach to the character or a fair assessment of the film's themes is arguable. But what I take away from the film is that, while we're not fundamentally better than the cruel and selfish people that we see throughout, we can view the film as a cautionary tale about our own tendencies to reflect this non-compassionate worldview and view our own emotional coldness to what we see in the film as a sign that, because we have the capacity to do worse, we also have the capacity to do better. If there's anything to say coming out of the killing of a sacred deer, it's that we should seek proper communication with loved ones. We should seek to understand them through their own subjectivity and not just through their relation to ourselves. And we should make decisions based on mutual interest and not purely self-interest. As well, the killing of a sacred deer tells us that we shouldn't aspire to positions of power if it's only to find comfort and control. We should take it as a serious ethical responsibility and hold ourselves and allow others to hold us ethically responsible for our role of power whenever we are competent to fit that role. If you want to be a doctor, you should, but you should do it for the right reasons and recognize the ethical ambiguity that comes from having power over the lives and health of others and seek an ethically righteous course, rather than just a self-righteous one. It's a film that's easy to say I'm not like that when watching, but much more difficult to say I don't want to be like that. It should shake our confidence in ourselves a little, at least enough to introspect about whether or not we seek out relationships with others for the right reasons. Do we seek love, growth, compassion, and understanding, or do we seek power, control, and a social image that suits our wants or hides our insecurities? The Killing of a Sacred Deer is a great film and it's worth a watch. Thank you. See you in the next one.